What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over in-game store part 4 in our fighting game tutorial series. So in this episode we are going to be going over multiple rows of items. So in the previous episodes we were able to navigate through menu items and change our categories. So we go to characters, stages, outfits and skins, and game settings. Right now I only have unlockable items for characters and stages. Of course, we only have a certain amount of space on the screen, so we want to make sure that whatever category we are on, we can see all the items. And to do this, we can set a maximum number of items that we would like to display per row, and then update our page to represent how many rows there are. So I've added some additional temporary entries to my store for my characters, so you can see I have 6 entries now, and for my stages I have 8. But they're not all in one row. I have different rows to them. So I can navigate left and right. We won't be able to navigate up and down today. Navigating up and down is just going to go through our category still. It is not going to go through the individual items on the category. That will be the final navigation logic episode for our in-game store. After that, we will get into actually purchasing items. So going over to them, unlocking them, and then seeing different results in-game. So we're almost there. But this time we're just focusing on making sure we fill out our store correctly and with multiple rows and columns. So right now you can see I've set 4 to be my maximum number of elements in each row, but I do have a variable that is easily changed, and that can update that value in a very, very quick amount of time. So if I change that to be 5 and I launch this again, go into my store, now I have 5 elements in my row. And so after 5 elements, it will break and go to the next row. So if you'd like to get caught up in the series and check out everything we've done in this fighting game tutorial series, I believe we are on episode 176, so you can check out all the combat, all the menus, the music, the sound effects, everything that we've done to get to this point. Alternatively, if you just care about the in-game story, you don't have to watch the rest of the series to learn about that. I would recommend starting from part 1 of the in-game store, which I'll link in this icon in the top right corner right here. With all that said, we can go ahead and get started. So we don't need anything in the code today. Everything we're doing is going to be in our blueprints, and we already have our store widget. Now it's a little messy right now. As usual, I will clean it up as the episode goes on. But there's one major thing that we actually have to do today, and that is change our item horizontal box to be a store row. The item horizontal box was a horizontal box widget that we put inside of a vertical box widget. We used it to hold our store item icons, and these are the individual items. So every item gets one of these icons, and then all of these icons get put into the horizontal box here, and that is how we can see the things on the screen for the mutant, the mannequin, these new ones that I've added, which are just temporary, and all these stages as well. These are all store item icons. But with only one horizontal box, we can only do one row. To do multiple rows, we need to be able to add horizontal boxes to this vertical box. However, that itself gets a little complicated because some widgets can't be created easily. For example, if I want to create a widget in my store widget right here, I can type create widget and then select the class type that I want. However, you'll notice that there's not horizontal box. If I type that in, nothing comes up. So how am I going to create a new horizontal box whenever I need to populate more data in that vertical box? Well, a simple way is to actually create our own widget, because we can construct our own widgets. And so I made one called store row that holds what I'm calling row, but really what it is it's just a standard horizontal box. It's this tiny box because it's got nothing in it. This is a new widget with nothing but a horizontal box in it that I've called row. And so I can access the horizontal box from the store row widget. So I can add a store row to the vertical box and then grab the horizontal box from that. So now if we try and create widget, we can grab our store row, and off of the store row we can then grab our row, which is our horizontal box. There you go. There are, of course, other ways to do this, so if you are familiar with another way and you want to use it, by all means. We just need different ways to get horizontal boxes in our vertical box. You could put a bunch of horizontal boxes in here by default, and then that way you don't have to create any additional. You could just not store anything in them if you don't need to. So essentially you could put 4 horizontal boxes in here, for example, and you could only use 2 of them if you only need to use 2 of them because you only have enough elements for 2 of those boxes. There's genuinely nothing wrong with that method, but it does give you a maximum amount that you can have. You have to keep manually adding new horizontal boxes to your vertical box every time you reach the maximum amount. That way you can then add more to the next horizontal box. This way is more dynamic, but it's not required for every project. It does take quite a few items to fill that up. However, it's good to have the option to expand and add more, and if you happen to go over, then this system will take care of it. So we are going to change our item horizontal box, like I said, to our store row. So let's go ahead and make this store row widget. So go to wherever you want your widget to be made, add new, user interface, widget blueprint. I called mine store row. And then I have this empty widget. In Unreal 4, you start off with a canvas panel. You don't in Unreal 5, but we don't actually need the canvas panel, so you can leave it if you have one, but it's not required. What we need is the horizontal box. So just grab a horizontal box, add it to the default element in your widget. And again, I left mine the same size. That's why it's so tiny, because it doesn't have anything in it. And there's a few things we want to do here. One, let's rename this. You could keep it just called horizontal box, but I just want to call it row. Renaming it to row just makes our life a little bit easier because we know exactly what we're accessing. We're accessing this row. After renaming it, I also made sure that I sized to content. That is important because if you don't size to content, yes, it looks a little bit bigger on the store row widget, but that's not important. What happens is when you actually have it in the store widget, if I go into the store, since it has a specific size and it's not sized to the content, it keeps the size that we gave it. And so anything that is in other widgets will overlap or block each other. If we instead size the horizontal box to the content, it will then become as big as the elements that it is holding. So the next row will have to be below the first because they can't occupy the same space in the vertical box. So that's an important thing to make sure we do. Make sure that our horizontal box that I'm calling row and our store row widget is sized to content. So it will automatically resize based on the information or the data that we give it. There's nothing else that you need to set in the details panel other than making it a variable. Make sure that you check is variable because we're going to access it in our store widget quite frequently to add the elements to it. So we do need to be able to access this specific horizontal box. So we need it to be a variable. There's also nothing in the graph, no variables, no functions. This variable is just because we made the row a variable. But you don't have to add anything else in here. In fact, you can go ahead and delete this. It can be completely empty. So once you've done that, you're done with the store row widget. Really, we just created that so that we can have a horizontal box item that we can spawn and use whenever we need it. Now, one thing you can do is add a store row into your vertical box by default. I'd recommend keeping one because we can probably assume we always are going to want one, the same way we did with the item horizontal box where we always had one, but we don't actually need the item horizontal box anymore. I wouldn't delete it just yet because we want to move everything that was in the item horizontal box to be in the store row now. Then we can get rid of it after that. So go ahead and add this store row element to the item vertical box as a start. So we'll have item vertical box, we'll have item horizontal box, and then we'll have a store row widget. Let's go into the graph and let's start replacing all the references of item horizontal box with our new store row or with some other method that we have here. Now this might be a little bit confusing at first, but just bear with me. I believe it will all make perfect sense by the time we are done. There's actually not too much logic that we actually need to add today, but it might be a little bit strange looking at it because it is something that we've never quite done before. So I've added 3 new variables. They are all integers. I've added a current horizontal box, a max elements in row, and a current elements in row. These 3 variables are used to actually update the vertical box properly with the data that we need. So we're going to take a look at the current horizontal box we're on, see how many elements are in the row, and then check to see if we reach the maximum number of elements. And if we have, we want to go to the next horizontal box. We want to create one. We want to update the current horizontal box, and then we want to update the current elements in row, resetting it to 0, and let it go through that process again. So essentially, look for, in our case, 5 elements for each row. Once we reach that 5th element, spawn it, then create a new horizontal box, or really a new store row widget, and we are going to then start adding elements to that instead. So, like I said, let's add 3 variables, all integers. So I have current horizontal box, integer, defaulting to 0. Then I have max elements in row, integer. This one is going to default to 5 for me, but really you need to default it to whatever value that you want for how many elements are in each row. Basically, how many columns you want to have on your store here. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I want my max elements in row to be 5. Then I have current elements in row. This is just going to keep track of how many items we have in the current row that we're in. That is also 0 by default. Once you make these 3 variables, you will have to compile. That way you can actually set the default values. So compile if you haven't, set your defaults, and we're good to go. Now, these 3 variables are going to be very useful in allowing us to update our logic to change it from the horizontal box to the store row widget. Essentially, we need to go to all the places in the code where a horizontal box was used and update it for the new logic. So in event construct, toward the end of it, we were getting all the data table row names, looping through them, and grabbing all the data for every single unlockable item in the store. Then, if it matched our default type, character for me, we were creating a store item icon widget, setting the details on it, and then adding the item to the horizontal box. However, now I've done a change, and it's a pretty big change, but this is going to ensure that we add the data to the correct row as opposed to just adding it to the same horizontal box over and over again. This is the first one we have to replace. So you can see I've disconnected it. These 2 are no longer connected. So add child to horizontal box to item horizontal box, the one we're trying to replace, is no longer functional. Instead, I'm doing this. So I will go ahead and get rid of this and place this in line here so it's easier to read and to look at. All right. And so now everything that I have highlighted here is new. Everything else in this function is exactly the same. So this is what we're going to be adding. Now, to get the proper store row or the proper horizontal box that we need to add items to, we need to know what horizontal box we're currently on in terms of adding items to. So when we add our first set of items, like the mannequin, the mutant, and these 3 question marks, we have 0 as the current horizontal box because we defaulted the variable to 0 and we haven't needed to increment it since index 0 is fine here. However, once we've reached 5 elements, we want to make sure we increment that row so that we're on the next row, in which case current horizontal box will be 1. And that is how we're going to access the correct store row widget to add these items to. So we need to make sure we keep our current horizontal box at the right value. To be able to test this properly, you will need however many items in your row that it takes for it to break and go to the next row. So I am going to go to my unlockable item data and just show you what I did. I added a bunch of rows here for stages and characters. So right now I've marked them as like hidden, but really they're just temporary assets, so you could use whatever you want. but I've made a bunch of new elements in my data table, 4 for stages and 4 for characters. So I just put stage hidden, keep playing to unlock details on the stage with my random icon, and made it type stage. Copied that or duplicated it 4 times, and then did the same thing for the characters as well, except just renamed it to be characters and keep playing to unlock details on this character, then set the type to be character. And this gave me that padding and those extra items that I needed to properly test this and play around with it. Also, make sure to rename your row names just so that they match the same style and same formatting. Now, once you have that, we can go back to our event graph in the store widget. And instead of just using item horizontal box, now we want to get the child at item vertical box. So our vertical box is this big one here. This is what stores all of our horizontal box, or really what stores all of our store rows. And so if we get the item vertical box and get child at, we can pass it an index and return the result. Now, the vertical box has the store rows and they have children under them, but luckily get child at only cares about the parent index. So if you want to get a specific child below that, you would grab the horizontal box first and then get child at on an index in that horizontal box. So it is safe to assume only every top level item in the vertical box will count as a child. So item horizontal box does, but nothing stored within that does. Store row does, but nothing stored within that does. It also goes in order, starting at index 0. So every horizontal box that we add, starting from 0, increments 1. So get child at index 0 right now is actually item horizontal box. But item VB get child at index 1 is actually store row. We want to get our first instance of the store row. Again, we're trying to replace the item horizontal box, so we don't need to do that one. We want to get store row. So I'm going to get my current horizontal box value and just pass it into the get child at here. The problem with that right now is that since we have the item horizontal box in here, index 0 is really this guy, but really we want it to be this one. So for the time being, I've arbitrarily added a +1 and passed that into the index. That's what you're seeing here. So this +1 is arbitrary just to skip the item horizontal box until we get into actually removing that later in this episode. So essentially we're getting the first store row widget. Now, we do have to cast it to that type anyway, because we need to grab the horizontal box off of it. So we now want to cast to our store row. And once we do that, you should be able to drag off of it and type get row. And this is your horizontal box. Now, we just want to do what we were doing previously to the horizontal box, item horizontal box, on this item. So here is where we call add child to horizontal box. So before we were doing item horizontal box, add child to horizontal box, and we were passing in the element that we created from this create store item icon widget. That's what these reroute nodes were for. So this was in here. This is what we previously had. Now we're using this row, calling the same function, and using the same content. We're just using a different target. After these nodes are done, you will have successfully added each individual item to that horizontal box. But we also have to take into account the rows, remember that, because if we just left it here, we would have 8 characters in the first row. In fact, I can show you if I disconnect this. It works, but we have way too many characters in that row, too many elements in that horizontal box. So this logic going forward is going to be the control for what horizontal box is the correct one to add items to. So taking a look at this now, basically what we want to do is every time we create an item and add it to the horizontal box, we want to update our current elements in row. Remember that this starts at 0 and we're checking to see if it ever reaches the max elements in row. Once it does, we need a new row. So we're going to grab our current elements in row variable, and I'm going to increment it, basically add 1 to it. Then I'm going to take the result of that increment and check if it's greater than or equal to max elements in row, which for me, again, is 5. We're going to bring that result into a branch. And that is what you see right here. Now, if the branch is false, meaning current elements in row is less than max elements in row, we can safely assume that we have not filled out the first row, or not filled out the first horizontal box, and so we don't need another one. We can end our logic here. But if current elements in row is either greater than or equal to max elements in row, we have filled the entire row. We've filled up the entire horizontal box. So we need to add a new one. To do that, we can increment our current horizontal box right here, another increment int, and we can also reset current elements in row back to 0 since we're starting on a new row. This is resetting all the variables we need for the next row. Then we're going to create a new store row widget at this point. And we're going to go to store row widget. Then to our item vertical box, we're going to call add child to vertical box, and we're going to add this new element that we just created. And there you go. So now we will always add all the elements that are in our data table. And once we reach the maximum number of elements that we should store per row, we create a new store row widget and add that to the vertical box. Since we incremented our current horizontal box at this point, we will be able to then access the correct horizontal box when we go to add the child that is spawned from the store item icon to the proper horizontal box. If it doesn't make sense, we are going to do it again in the change category, slightly differently, but almost exactly the same. And so we'll go over it quickly in here as well. So let's go to change category real quick, and let's go to the very start of the function. So when we change categories, we need to reset all of our data and access it properly again, and get new data that is relevant to the category. So in this case, for example, I have 6 characters, but I have 8 stages, so they are not the same. Now, for outfits and skins, I don't have any. For game settings, I don't have any, but I could have 1 row for some items, 2 rows for others, 3 for others, and so not all categories are the same. Even though we did it in event construct, that only worked the first time when we were on that first tab. To add it on these other categories, we need to make sure we update it every single time we change categories. So at the start of change category, we're going to reset our variables. So we're going to reset current elements in row to be 0 and current horizontal box to be 0. So I'm going to make some space for this. And I'm going to reset both these variables. So whenever we change categories, these reset to 0. We assume we're starting from scratch because we really are. We want to grab all the data again and make sure that we're working with the proper data. Then we were doing something called clear children on the item horizontal box. Now, the item horizontal box is the one we're trying to replace. So we're still going to call clear children, but I have a new method here to clear children for each individual horizontal box in our vertical box. So let's make some space for this as well. All right, and this is a little messy, but nothing a few reroute nodes won't fix. So now to clear every row from our vertical box, we need to loop through all the children in our item vertical box. And to do that, we can grab our item vertical box, get all children, then we can drag off of that and go into a for each loop. And we need to grab each individual array element. Remember, this is going to be currently 1 item horizontal box, 1 store row, and any additional store rows that we added during the event construct or during another category change. Then we're going to drag off of our array element, cast to the store row, grab the row, and then we're going to call clear children on that. So I don't mean to keep repeating it, but it's true. We're just replacing the item horizontal box with this new row, with each individual row that we have in our vertical box. So I'm going to delete this logic, and I'm going to remove item horizontal box and just move clear children over. Because really that is all the logic that we want. And now that I've done that, I can clean it up again. And something like this looks pretty good. So all the highlighted nodes is what we added here. And now we have reset every horizontal box that we have in our vertical box, not just that initial default one that exists here. Then we had a switch on int where we were checking the type for character, stage, outfit, and game settings, and grabbing the appropriate store item icons and setting the item details. Then we were calling the item horizontal box and adding the item that we created, the same thing we were doing in event construct. So all 4 of these cases are going to be replaced by logic up here. So I have it written here twice to show you what the differences will be, and then we'll combine it and make it a little bit cleaner. This is the same exact logic as in event construct, so you can actually copy all the nodes that you added in your construct for today. One thing to note, you'll notice that I'm not adding the elements to the vertical box. I'm not adding new rows if they hadn't already existed at this point. There is a reason for that. I will be covering that in the next episode because it really is going to be a lot more important there. Right now it will cause some visual issues if we start the initial category with less rows than another category that we have. So for example, if characters only had 1 row but say just has 2, you would actually run into a little bit of an error here at the current time. But like I said, we're going to have to handle that anyway in the next episode. So I'm going to hold off on dealing with that now because it'll make more sense when we can control the menu as to why that's happening and what the solution is. But other than that, you can copy everything that we did today in the event graph up to that point and paste them in here and change category. And the only thing that is different between these two, the top one and the bottom one here, is the item I'm passing into the add child to horizontal box content parameter. And I'm passing in the same thing we were passing in to the item horizontal box add child to horizontal box, which is basically the created store item icon widget. So again, we are just replacing the horizontal box data with our new system. So you can see for the top one here, I'm passing in the content from this first create, which is only the character store item icon widgets. But for the second one that I had here, I'm using the content that is created from the second branch, which is all the stage store item icon widgets. I'm going to delete my bottom one that I have here. And I'm just going to have this top set of logic. To make things a little bit less ugly, I'm going to remove the item horizontal box, add child to horizontal box, since we don't need that anymore. And I will move this over to where I want to put it. And there we go. So now we have this in place for where we want it to be. And we've only got one of them, but we need all 4 of these paths to take it. So I'm going to remove my other item horizontal box, add child to horizontal box. And I'm going to space this out a little bit. And I'm going to copy this 4 times. And at this point, we are good to go. Now, feel free to clean it up. Feel free to use the select back at the start here. That is entirely up to you. However you want to handle it is fine. And you won't be able to do exactly what I'm doing here yet, but you can see after making that change, now I can change my categories. And I can properly navigate through my area, displaying the correct number of elements in each row. So this is working nicely, and now the different categories can all have the proper amount of elements and the proper number of rows. At this point, there are two other things that we need to adjust, and that is our display hovered item option and determine item button to focus. So we have two functions here. We had separate functions for category button to focus and item button to focus. The categories are the characters, stages, outfits, and game settings, whereas the items are the individual items like the mannequin or a specific stage that I had. So display hovered item option. Before, we were displaying our option based on the element in the item horizontal box, but we no longer want to do that. We need to grab the item that the player is on in the correct store row widget. So like we've been doing with the rest of this episode, we are going to replace the item horizontal box in display hovered item option with a new method. So I'm going to get rid of the item horizontal box. And we'll clean this up and bring this up here. And so now where we were using get all children for the item horizontal box, we're still going to do that, but we're going to use these nodes to get all children. So we're going to grab our item vertical box, and we're going to get the child at our current horizontal box. Then we're going to cast that result to be a store row, and assuming that cast succeeds, we can grab the actual row element off of it and plug that into get all children. The rest of the logic in here is fine and safe to keep. You don't have to change anything about it. Just changing what element we're checking when navigating. Now the same thing goes for determine item button to focus. Here is our function from before. We were using item horizontal box and getting all children. At this point, you probably know what that means. We can go ahead and get rid of the item horizontal box, and instead we will want to use this new method that we have. I can put this in here cleanly. And something like that will do the trick. So we're using item vertical box, get child at current horizontal box, cast to store row, and plug that into the get all children that the item horizontal box was previously in. Now once you do this, you should be able to navigate through your store. You won't be able to go up and down, like I said, well you will, but you'll go to the categories instead. However, you should be able to navigate and the correct data should display at the bottom. And we're pretty much done. What we need to do now is remove the other horizontal box that was hard-coded in here, the item horizontal box, as we should no longer need it. But let's make sure. Let's find our item horizontal box variable, right-click on it, and find references. Make sure that no results are found. Basically, we're not using it in here. If we're not using it, you can go ahead and delete it from the design view. It is no longer taking up space in the vertical box. But when we go into the store now, nothing will be here. That is because our indices are now wrong. Remember that we were adding 1 to current horizontal box to skip over the horizontal box that we had in here for the purposes of this episode. We can now remove that 1 and just plug in current horizontal box on the get child at. Now we will have to change this for category as well, but when we come in here, you'll notice that it does work, but we're on the wrong row. And why is that? That is because we are in the constructor updating our current horizontal box as we create them, but that should only be for when we create them. The up and down navigation will also utilize this, and so we need to make sure that it is at the current value for where the player should be. Once the elements have been added to each horizontal box, what we really want to do is make sure that we reset that value back to default. And specifically, we need to do it before we call our move selection. That determines where the player is at on the menu for the first time. So we want to make sure that we set our current horizontal box to 0 when the loop has finished. So we've gone through and updated the store with everything in the unlockable item data table, but before we call move selection. Now when we do this, you'll see that I can go into the store and I am on the right level. I'm on the top row starting out. When you go to change categories, you will see that the second row is missing, and this is for the same reason. So we can go ahead and fix this by going into change category and removing all of the +1s in here as well. We don't need those any longer. So we can just use current horizontal box. We don't need to use +1. That was just a hack to replace the item horizontal box with our new store row widget. So remove this in all your places. You don't need that +1 anymore. And now when you play, you'll notice that the elements should be back when changing categories. But you start on the bottom row again, and so you probably know what we have to do at this point. After we change categories and we go through and we set up all the horizontal boxes, we need to make sure that we reset current horizontal box to 0. Again, best spot to do this would be right before we call move selection, which is the node that all of these branches, all these paths link up to. So we can just set current horizontal box back to 0. And finally, once we do that, we will go into our store. Everything looks good. I can navigate it. I can go to stages, and I start at the top row. Now all that's left is for us to do vertical navigation on the items within the category, and then we will have full control over this widget, and we can actually get into the buying of these items and unlocking them. But anyway, guys, after all that work, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this helped you learn a little bit about some more menu navigation. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the series than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. You guys are awesome and always give me great ideas to work on, so thank you so much for that. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to help get you situated so that you can keep working on your game. But otherwise, guys, that is all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.